Welcome to This Explainer. We're diving right in today because we've got some truly awe-inspiring historical accounts to cover. We're going to explore the extraordinary narratives, traditions, and documented anomalies surrounding the birth of Prophet Muhammad, sallallahu. Today, we're looking at a series of events that started in the quiet desert of Mecca, but allegedly sent shockwaves across the entire known world. Let's get right to it. So, let me ask you, what connects a giant elephant in Mecca to a shattered palace in ancient Persia? I mean, it sounds like the setup to an epic fantasy novel, right? But according to the historical sources we're examining today, these events are deeply connected. We're going to trace exactly how a localized, seemingly unbeatable threat in Arabia created historical ripples that literally shook the foundations of the greatest empires on Earth. Chapter 1. The Year of the Elephant. Our story begins just 2 months before the birth. Okay, so picture this. A tyrannical governor in Yemen named Abraha is furious. His golden church in Sana'a was desecrated, and he wants revenge. He vows to tear the Kaaba in Mecca down, stone by stone. So he mobilizes this terrifying force of 60,000 armed men. And keep in mind, Mecca wasn't some fortified military stronghold. It was basically an unprotected desert city. So a 60,000-strong army marching toward it, that meant absolute certain annihilation for everyone living there.
But Abraha doesn't just bring soldiers. He decides to use psychological warfare and petitions the Ethiopian king for his absolute largest African elephant, a beast named Mahmud. Now, African elephants are on a completely different level compared to Indian elephants. We're talking up to 10,000 kilograms and over 14 feet tall. Imagine being a desert dweller in Arabia. You've only ever seen camels your whole life, and suddenly this towering, literal war machine appears on the horizon. It was meant to just freeze the Meccans in absolute terror.
So the army arrives at the outskirts of the city and captures the local livestock. This includes the camels of Mecca's leader, Abdul Muttalib, who is actually the future grandfather of the prophet. Now, Abdul Muttalib goes to meet this terrifying governor, Abraha, but instead of begging for the city's survival, he calmly delivers this totally unforgettable response. He basically says, "I am the owner of these camels, while the owner of this house knows how to protect it." He just demands his stolen camels back. He left the ultimate defense of the Kaaba entirely in the hands of God. And that brings us to the stunning sequence of what historical accounts say happens next. First, Mahmud the elephant and the others flat out refuse to advance towards the city. I mean, no matter how much they're beaten, they won't budge. Second, as evening rolls in, the sky suddenly turns pitch black from the direction of the sea. Third, millions of low-flying birds swarm the entire area, and get this, each bird is carrying 3 tiny gram-sized stones. Finally, these stones are dropped with such devastating force that they literally pierce through the soldiers, instantly decimating the 60,000-strong army. Abraha is mutilated and forced to flee back to Yemen in sheer panic.
Section 2. Dreams of a coming leader. This unbelievable victory over Abraha didn't just save Mecca, it acted as a massive historical flare.
The news of this event spread like wildfire. It immediately fixed the eyes of global superpowers, like the Roman and Persian empires, directly onto this previously ignored patch of desert. They knew something monumental was brewing there. Inside Arabia, a really intense anticipation began to build. Scholars across the region were actively waiting. A revered Jewish scholar from Syria named Ibn al-Biban, living in Yathrib, openly prophesied a coming Meccan leader. You had a Syrian monk stunning Arab travelers by telling them a prophet was coming, even specifically naming him Muhammad. Meanwhile, Jewish scholars in Medina were buzzing. One of them even claimed to have spotted a specific red star that only rises when a new prophet is about to be born. It's like a giant puzzle, and all the pieces were starting to connect. Even locally, the signs were profoundly personal. Abdul Muttalib himself had a terrifying, incredibly vivid dream. He saw a glowing tree rising from the earth, illuminating the entire world, while people actively tried to chop it down before being stopped. When he took this dream to a priestess, she turned completely pale. She interpreted it to mean that a descendant of his would very soon rule both the East and the West. Chapter 3, The Miraculous Night of Birth. We've now arrived at the emotional core of our explainer. The birth happens at dawn on a Monday in the month of Rabi al-Awwal. But it was preceded by real heartbreak. The child's father, Abdullah, had tragically passed away from an illness on a trading journey before the birth, leaving behind a meager inheritance of just 5 camels, some goats, and a maidservant. Now, at the time, the Meccans had this cultural practice involving a Burma.
It's essentially a large, heavy stone slab or pot placed over a newborn. According to the accounts, when they placed this heavy stone over the newborn prophet, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, it miraculously cracked perfectly in two. When the women rushed over to check on him, they found the newborn child completely unbothered, just staring intently up at the sky. And the sources cite just a rapid-fire cascade of stunning local anomalies that night. His mother, Amina, reported an entirely painless birth. The child was born already circumcised and perfectly clean. Witnesses in the room described a sudden, radiant light that seemed to stretch all the way from the east to the west. And out in the city of Mecca, men reported that these large, heavy stone idols suddenly just fell flat on their faces, while mysterious voices announced the birth of a child who would illuminate the world.
Section 4. Empires tremble across the globe. Now, we're going to pivot from that quiet room in Mecca to the global stage.
Because these shockwaves, they weren't just local. They were felt instantly across the globe. According to the accounts, in the Persian Empire, the sacred temple fire, which had literally been kept burning continuously for centuries, suddenly just went out, extinguished. Over in Ethiopia, the king was struck entirely mute and paralyzed by this terrifying vision of a head emerging from the ground, declaring the birth of a prophet. And perhaps the wildest of all, thousands of miles away in Indonesia, the waters of the Sea of Savu mysteriously began to boil.
Meanwhile, back in Mecca, Amina described yet another incredible vision. She saw a light so bright she could actually see it illuminating the distant palaces of Busra, all the way in Syria. Biographers point out a really fascinating historical foreshadowing here, noting that Busra would later become the very first Roman city conquered by the prophet's future generals.
Okay, let's jump back to Persia for a second and focus on this exact number, 14. During an earthquake, that exact same night, exactly 14 massive bulwarks, those are big structural bastions, cracked and fell from the palace of the Persian king Khusrau Anushirwan. Unsettled, the king seeks an interpretation. A dying Syrian scholar reveals a pretty chilling prophecy. Those 14 fallen bulwarks meant exactly 14 Persian kings remained before their mighty empire would collapse entirely. And, astonishingly enough, history shows the empire fell after precisely that succession.
Chapter 5. King Saif's Hidden Prophecy. Let's bring the narrative back down to a deeply personal level. Shortly after the birth, Abdul-Muttalib makes a diplomatic trip to Yemen to congratulate the newly crowned King Saif. But during the visit, King Saif pulls him aside in absolute secret. He reveals these ancient texts describing a coming leader with highly specific biographical and physical signs. He says the child will be orphaned, raised by his grandfather and uncle, bear a distinct physical mark between his shoulders, and will eventually settle in Yathrib, the city we now know as Medina. Imagine hearing your exact, specific family situation described perfectly by a foreign king. It caused Abdul-Muttalib to literally weep in recognition.
But this revelation came with a very stark warning. The dying king Saif warned Abdul-Muttalib of immense geopolitical jealousy. He stated that neighboring factions, specifically citing some Jewish tribes of the time who were expecting a prophet from their own lineage, would create a mountain of troubles for Muhammad if they discovered his identity too soon. He strongly urged the grandfather to keep the boy's destiny an absolute secret. So, returning safely to Mecca, Abdul-Muttalib celebrates the birth. On the 7th day, he performs the Akikah. It's a traditional ceremony of sacrifice and naming. He slaughters camels and literally feeds the entire city of Mecca for 3 straight days. It was right here, amidst this massive feast, that he officially announced the child's name to the Quraysh. And he announced the name Muhammad, meaning the one who is praised. Now his mother, Amina, had actually named him Ahmed, meaning the most praising of God. But his grandfather specifically chose Muhammad. When people asked why he chose a name that was relatively uncommon among his ancestors, Abdul-Muttalib replied that he wanted his grandson to be praised in the heavens and the earth. Which brings us to a profound question to wrap up this explainer. How did the quiet birth of an orphan in the desert create a ripple effect that reshaped the entire modern world? You know, the sources end with a really touching story about a Meccan man named Zayd ben Amr. Disgusted by idolatry, Zayd actively waited for this prophet. When he realized he was going to die before actually meeting him, he asked a young boy to pass on his belief and his greetings to the coming prophet. Years later, that message was delivered, and it said Zayd was rewarded for his foresight. It really leaves us to reflect on how these miraculous accounts, from a shattered army of elephants to boiling seas and cracked empires, laid the historical foundation for a legacy that continues to echo so loudly today. Thanks for joining me on this explainer. Keep learning, and I'll catch you next time.